Yeah, I was just talking to Jeff to see like how to make an introduction for this week. And now I think I'm going to sort of skip that because I think everybody here is almost from graduate design. Like we have students from this year, then we have the students who are from last year who are going to present this week, their independent projects. And I see now we also have students from 2 years ago who've probably come to watch over the people who are going to present this year to make sure that they're going to be just as good. In the next few days, the AA community will see one of the crucial innovations of the graduate design program as these 18 candidates for the graduate diploma present their independent work for critical assessment in a public setting. An essential aspect of this process is to assemble a diverse jury of international caliber to offer critical judgment. Last year we had Toyo Ito, Terry Riley, and Ben Van Berkel. And this year, Mohsen Mostafavi will chair the jury consisting of Zaha Hadid, Hadi Mirmiran, and Andrew Zago. And tonight I have this special pleasure to introduce Andrew Zago, which is a very difficult thing to do because there's only one architect that I think I know so well, probably better than any other architect, because I've known him for a very long time. I can't even remember how long, as a student, as an architect, and as a teacher. Maybe there is sort of one more thing to do, but I don't know. Andrew has taught at Southern California Institute of Architecture for a very long time. And he is also taught at Cornell University, which is the state of New York, I guess, right, somewhere up there. And he's now teaching at Michigan University. He graduated from the School of Architecture at Harvard, the Graduate School of Design. And very shortly after that, we formed Axruno in Los Angeles as our practice. And a few years after that, we included, or should I say, sort of guided, he's sitting here, by Jeffrey Kipnis, who joined our practice. And now Andrew is practicing on his own, as I guess as Jeffrey is, sort of. So, I mean, I don't want to sort of belabor this anymore. So this is Andrew Zago.
Hello. About a week ago, I was sitting in Detroit working on my lecture for this evening, and I was sort of busy putting my slides together, thinking about talking about my projects and what I was going to say about them, when I got a phone call from Michael Hansel from the graduate program, telling me that they're about to put out the poster and I needed to give him the title of my lecture. Well, I mean, up until then I thought it was going to be works or maybe recent works or projects. And so all of a sudden I was put on the spot and I thought, well, now I've got to come up with a title. And I spent sort of the next 24 hours going through about 300 different titles. And rather than go with the first one, which was choreographs, I came up with a title, After the Profession. And then I realized, when I came here, not only was I going to have to show my work, but I was going to now have to say something about this topic. Not only about the profession, but actually about after the profession. Luckily, it's something that wasn't pulled out of the blue, but it's something I've been thinking about for a while. So in order to fulfill a kind of contractual obligation, prior to showing some of my projects, I just wanted to go over really just some notes about thoughts that I've been having relative to architecture and architecture as a professional practice. And I guess the most central point about this, the sort of overarching point, is the realization that imagination, or more specifically, creative imagination, is the architect's most valuable professional asset. Now, I mean, on one hand, that's a kind of nicety or something that one could say in general. But I think it also has a particular relevance. And I would say that this notion of creative imagination is not only a kind of demand, but is a need that one can find in society. You know, within a kind of overt picture or perception of the world, there is always within that, latently, another radical structure. A radical structure of space which actually exposes reality as a constructed artifice, and at the same time it affirms the priority of spirit and form. And it's the architect, or in a sense any artist's unique task to actually construct a way into that sort of latent vision or latent intuition through work, and actually produce something which has the potential to become a transformative experience for the public. Architecture, in that sense, is a kind of, or an architect is a kind of instrument to speak or to construct this radical intuition. And when I think about that, I think also of the sort of conventional use of the term architect, or the use of the term architect outside of architecture. People refer to, for instance, Richard Holbrooke as the architect of the Bosnian peace accord. And it's very interesting what they mean precisely by that. They don't mean that he was the person who sort of embellished it or gave it a particular decoration or style. And they also don't mean that it was exactly problem solving, but rather that he was able to put together a fundamental structure that allowed a nation and a group of nations to regain operation. Architecture, at least potentially, always establishes a spatial framework that structures one's engagement with the world. And in doing that, in part, it shapes a culture's self-identity. Again, this aspect of architecture not only has a kind of general relevance, but actually, I think this ability is in demand. You know, about 2 years ago, it just came to mind recently, there was an American architecture magazine called Progressive Architecture. And a lot of you are probably familiar with it, but it's kind of the sort of most popular of the popular design magazines for designers in architecture in the United States. Its other two rivals were not considered as much sort of high design, I guess, as progressive architecture. A couple of years ago, they started to do a series of sort of sensationalized or sort of tabloid-style headlines on the cover. And the first one was a picture of Gary Cooper as Howard Rourke, and the headline, "Can the Profession Be Saved?" And I mean, I thought that was very interesting, and talking with colleagues. In fact, I think I remember talking to Bahram at the time, who said, by the time PA covers it, it's already dead. And in fact, it's true. Some of the observations were correct. The basic fact that architecture has reduced its field of expertise down to the aesthetic shaping of volumes, buildings as volumes. But progressive architecture was very much part of the same system that it was trying to criticize, and it really didn't offer much in the way of an analysis or a solution of the problem, other than to looking at other professional disciplines such as engineering or medicine or law, and see ways that they've managed to kind of protect their own territory and expand it. I mean, I think on one hand, once you have to protect your territory by legislation, it's only at best a stopgap measure. But also, I realized that the problem was more serious and also more fundamental than that. It was more of a structural problem that architecture had within itself. So I thought it was very interesting about a week ago when in my faculty mailbox, let's see, can we have the lights, please? We received a fax announcing that, in fact, progressive architecture had gone out of business, bought by a competitor and closed down immediately. So it's partially, sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, there's been, from my observations in the United States as well as in other countries, in conversations with thoughtful practitioners, especially practitioners of roughly my generation, that is, people who have been out of architecture school for about 10 years and have had the chance to do a few things and gain some understanding of the profession, that there is a kind of angst that the field, the profession, which has worked for previous generations, is no longer going to work for us. This is a slide of the previous generation, which I came across. This is actually the office of Albert Kahn in Detroit in 1929, which actually at the time was the largest architecture practice in the world. In the background is the Fisher Building going up. So, I mean, that's not to say that there isn't work, that there isn't projects. Of course there are, and in some areas there's more, in other areas there's less, but rather that there isn't an idea or a kind of mandate for the profession. The problem is that architecture is not really viewed as an essential activity. And so I think that this is not just an isolated market problem, that is a market going up or down, nor in terms of design do I see our era as being a period of design fickleness, like a transition from one style to another, as we've seen in previous years. I think rather the kind of political dimension of architecture that I referred to before, that is, its ability to shape the public sphere, has either been lost or almost totally transferred to other fields. And that, in fact, architecture is no longer the primary arena for shaping the public's engagement with the world. And I think that then this anxiety about the profession is because architecture has exhausted its self-conception or its worldview or its operating paradigm. I think the core of architecture's current situation is spatial, or that is to say, the core of architecture's current problems has to do with its operating paradigm of space. And the paradigm that it operates under colors all aspects of architectural production, from its conception to its execution. And the paradigm is, I guess, a pre-20th century paradigm, which I could roughly call a classical space paradigm. By that, I don't mean architecture done in a classical style or having any kind of overt classical appearances, but rather based on certain kinds of models of the functioning and geometry of space that is classical. In design, the actual tools of design we have descriptive geometry, which stands like an invisible scaffolding underneath the entire litany of architectural drawings, the plan, the section, the elevation. So one has a kind of deceptive sense of freedom in the blank page, but in fact, when one sets down, say, to draw a plan, one instantly engages an entire system of geometry and all of the kinds of conditions that go with that. It's predicated on having a homogeneous and regular void of being able, a homogeneous and empty void of being able to have regular projective geometries happening in it, and also having the, a void space into which one can insert objects, and if one thinks of it in terms of a Euclidean geometry, having a kind of durability in time, or even more, a kind of absence from time. There's been a lot of ramifications for this. Architecture has, through this paradigm, actually projected an image of itself into the marketplace. In the marketplace, architecture is a known quantity. I always think of the model of Monopoly, not the activity, the game Monopoly. That's played in England, isn't it? You all know that. In that one, to play the game well, right, let's say it requires a certain skill, maybe even a certain art, it doesn't really matter what the house looks like or what the hotel looks like, right? In a sense, that is exactly the way the market responds relative to architecture. If you think of a scheme of a developer, let's say, at its kind of crassest extreme, there is no doubt in putting together a huge development project, a certain art, a certain thrill, and a certain leap of the imagination. But architecture doesn't really play a role in it. That is, it doesn't play a role other than it does in Monopoly. I was thinking, in fact, today that an interesting problem would be to redesign the houses and motels, houses and hotels in Monopoly, the criteria being that it would be successful if it actually causes you to play the game differently. This has this kind of paradigm, I think, is really culminated in a lot of post-war architectural traditions. And a lot of this came very clear to me in my 2 years at Cornell, being very much sort of a building that still very much has the kind of smell of Colin Rowe, even though he hasn't been around for several years. This formalist tradition went through and very carefully, I would say even surgically, removed architectural practice or architectural design from the ebb and flow of markets and of society by clearly defining the core and the only valid architectural concern as composition, that is, as the arrangement of objects in space. And this is not just Cornell, of course. The effects of that school of thought extends, I think, into this institution as well. So this had this kind of formalist separation of architecture as an issue of composition separated from life had many effects. One was, and if we separate architecture firms, as I think it's clear enough to do, into design firms from firms that are other than design firms, within a design firm, there was a willingness to abandon conventional areas of expertise or to ignore emerging potential areas of expertise, thinking that these were really outside of its true purpose and its aesthetic mandate. At the same time, because the spatial paradigm was given, this classical spatial paradigm, it was possible to suppress the question of space as a critical issue. It was basically a non-issue. It was a given. And at the same time, the reinforcement of the building as an object made any design opportunity or design commission result in an object as a foregone conclusion. The problem with this this view and this tradition is that the stable and predictable production of commissions is disappearing, or at least the structure of them is changing wildly. As we all know, other professions, whether it's engineering, interior design, construction management, have gone in and eroded into all sorts of areas of expertise of architecture. Excuse me. So the other one is that within a project, the architect's role is in fact diminished, the project being categorically determined in advance, and then sometimes even in the design of large and complex buildings, even volumetrically determined in advance. And then in this light, this self-defined task of shaping aesthetic volumes is also at odds with the fundamental spatial conception of society. That's what I meant by society's actual need for imagination. And this changing spatial conception is not just to do with building, but actually goes across a broad spectrum of disciplines. So on one hand, architecture has maintained this paradigm and has seen itself become more and more marginalized. At the same time, the market has also transformed. This is good. I actually never thought I would show diagrams like this in a lecture. Just to give a very brief example of the kinds of changing dynamics, I wanted to show, these are both diagrams from a book called Mass Customization by Joseph Pine. And what I wanted to show on the left is a diagram that, as nearly as possible, describes what I guess one could call the classical model of manufacturing. And that is a model that began with the Industrial Revolution, and in some ways the inevitability of it was shared by people as different as Adam Smith and Karl Marx, that eventually markets get more and more centralized and homogenized, that industrial societies tend towards a certain kind of logic that leads to mass production. Of course, its high point was reached in this century by Henry Ford and the assembly line. And there's certain features of it, which is that it's based on a certain predictable rate of technological innovation. It's based on a homogeneous market and consistent demands, and by a certain kind of economic feasibility that was made possible by all of this, which allowed extremely long life cycles of a particular product or a particular way of doing things. The model of this diagram would be efficiency through stability and control. On the right, we have a different diagram. In the book, The Second Industrial Divide, the authors Piori and Sable basically go through and make a very convincing argument that the entire model of mass production was in fact an aberration, in part by design and in part a historical accident, that once it's put into, once it has a chance to run its course, that in fact the model on the left almost never happened, or happened in extremely small and limited ways, and that in fact the model on the right is much closer to the kinds of dynamics that we see today, which is to say that each one of those other little arrows and squiggles is a degree of turbulence, and almost at every point where the almost inevitable seeming logic of mass production marched along, we have seen, for one thing, wild fluctuations in technology and rate of technological change. Of course, changes in demographics and changes in demands. And it also, you see at the bottom when they talk about niche markets, it actually came to a point where the exceptions started to become more the norm than the model. And this is exactly what happened, for instance, with the American and I think also the British automobile industry in the 70s. In response to this, it has been in some ways sort of amazing the kinds of things and the kinds of ideas that a competitive business, whether it's in manufacturing or in other fields, the kinds of features that they have in fact been able to reinvent themselves, to overturn hierarchical management structures, to break up the kind of vertical integration of a firm within one unit, and to adopt strategies. It's very common these days to hear in business texts such terms as unreason, mass customization, constant change, and permanent innovation. For architecture to function in this kind of world, I think that it must transform its structure in order to regain its originative role as manifester of unconscious spatial imaginings. It's not the shape, but the intuition of architecture that must radically change. Taken as a new totality, intricately woven into the web of happenstance, architecture evolves then a new kinesthetic sense. This sense presupposes a rejection of the classical paradigm of formalism. It embraces the dissolution of institutions and the emergence of the particular with all its awful stirrings. To transform architecture, transform its practice. Now, being sort of more of a practical bent than a theoretical bent, I've actually made a list of specific suggestions for architectural practice. And these are actually thoughts that I've gone through myself. And while some of them I won't treat in detail, I'll just go through them. The first one is to consider alternatives to the architectural firm. Create instead an interdisciplinary group of professionals that are joined to a common business idea and a vision of the future of the built environment. In this kind of endeavor, I think architecture would have to play a central role, but it would not be the only role. I think the other kinds of expertise that architects would do well to associate with are economics, engineering, sociology, and computing. The second thing is, as we've seen in other manufacturing fields, to actually ignore the mass markets or the conventional markets for architecture and to go after niche markets. At the same time, look for niche markets that are not defined in a typical way, that is, say, hospitals or housing, but actually to find things that come about from new programmatic demands in our potentially emerging markets. One way to do that is to define niche markets not by building types, but rather by performance features. The third point, and I think is quite an important one, is to form alternatives to the standard contractual relationships. I think in general, the idea of the contract versus the consensus has problems with creative endeavors. But I think in particular in architecture, the sort of relationships of client, architect, contractor that are formalized in the United States in the standard AIA contracts, and I think it's modeled originally on British architectural contracts, sets up already a kind of, on one hand, it sets up a kind of adversarial relationship between the various parties and tends to reinforce this idea of self-interest. And on the other hand, it makes architects engage in a project for the built environment at an extremely late stage. Basically, when it exists already as a commission, when the idea of it is already worked out, it's handed over to the architect. So another point is to try to engage in a project at an earliest stage possible, and not to have a client, but actually to work out another business arrangement, call it a virtual company. In place of the contract, I think it's possible to imagine other structures. I imagine, for instance, of the idea of a constitution rather than a contract. Constitution in a kind of literal sense. I think in the United States about the Constitution, however imperfect it may be, it proposes a certain idea, and then all of the participants to it then have an opportunity to function relative to that idea, whether it's critical of that or whether it's in support of that. They have, to some extent, some sort of relationship to that. In addition to that, I would also refer to, or as my next point rather, I would also refer to areas of regional specialization, and this is something that's also discussed by Piori and Sable. They talk about the famous example that many of you no doubt know about, which is the third Italy, that region of Italy that is, I guess, eastern central and eastern northern Italy, where entire regions or communities have become specialists in manufacturing a particular product or in providing a certain service. And it's quite different than the kind of mass production firms that one sees on, in Western Italy. Instead, these are made up of dozens, sometimes hundreds of extremely small firms. And by extremely small, I mean anywhere from 3 to maybe 100 people. And each of these firms act independently, are an independent entity, but they act in unison with a great number of the other firms. So what you do is, in fact, you have all of the features that you need that you would have in a large integrated manufacturing firm, but it's spread out across many different firms, and at any given point in time, the same firm might be engaged with several different fields, with several different projects, and at a different point in time, it may be in a different structure altogether. Another interesting feature of it is that it is done virtually without contracts. Another interesting version of that, not based on the traditional community like in Italy, but based on a different kind of expertise, was the early days of Silicon Valley, where in fact you had a number of small, very aggressive and very interesting entrepreneurs basically putting together the computer industry as we know it today, but based on a different model. So then, if in the business world a kind of competitive edge is given to open, chaotic, and unknown approaches, then in that field, imagination is actually a vital asset. I think what architects have to do, as I said before, is shift their spatial paradigm. I'm sorry for actually using a hackneyed expression, but it is sort of the precise term. And I think also of Thomas Kuhn's definition of the effects of a paradigm shift, which is actually to open perception to trends and structures and visions not previously discerned, potentially displacing the canons of design and bringing with it new design potentials and market opportunities. I think in architecture, the essential emerging quality is time. I think time within architecture simultaneously affects issues both of architecture's business expertise and of design. Of course, architecture has always been in time, but only as a latent quality or as something to stand in opposition to. And this is in part a consequence of the classical space paradigm. The vicissitudes of time, either long or short term, are viewed as independent of, or in fact contrary to the design goal, which is to create an edifice and see it existing as a permanent and ideal object. I propose instead to make the existence and production of architecture explicitly a part of the temporal flux. In terms of business, of course, one can see, I mentioned before the idea of a design firm versus a firm that is not designed, that is not design-oriented. In firms that are not design-oriented, you see all kinds of expertise coming in terms of time, whether it's fast-tracking, whether it's the design of teardowns, that is a building that has a predetermined lifespan before you even start, or whether it's a building that has to be phased, such as a hospital construction, phased complexly over time. But of course, all of these things are considered outside of architecture's design and aesthetic mandate. Consider instead architecture as event. That is, event as a location in 3 points of space and 1 point in time. as a series of perceptions in space-time. In that sense, you can imagine architecture not just as an object. If you imagine an entire spectrum of scales, ranging from the movement of a person through a space as a sort of fleeting event to, at the other end, I guess, the pyramids, as we were discussing this morning, then one could say that is just our preconception to say that something that has a longer durability is a work of architecture and something that has a relatively shorter durability is not architecture. I think it would be possible to see almost a continuous spectrum from the most fleeting to the most permanent, and also make an argument that that things tend towards the more fleeting these days. So if you imagine the flux of people, functions, materials, and even money without giving priority to all of them, but instead trying to visualize and then orchestrate this series of events, that is the research that I'm actually beginning now, and for which I use the term choreographs, which has both the sense of course, architecture as a dance of materials and things in space and in time, and also literally the graph of time. It's a multi-dimensional media, and it is made possible, at least the tuition of it, is made possible in part by computers, not in the sense of CAD drawing programs, which is really just an extension of conventional drawing tools, but other kinds of visualizations. I think what architects need to do this, I look at fields such as geology and understand that they've actually been able to develop something like a radically different time scale than what would be considered the scale of someone outside of that profession. And imagine, if you imagine a spectrum somewhere between, on one hand, geology and on the other, jazz improvisation, I think architecture would exist somewhere in between. And it's, in fact, the ideas of this come very directly from improvisation. I just want to, before I go to my projects, I just wanted to read a quote by Cornell West from Race Matters. Furthermore, the cultural hybrid character of black life leads us to highlight a metaphor alien to Malcolm X's perspective, yet consonant with his performances to audiences, namely the metaphor of jazz. I use the term jazz here not so much as a term for a musical art form as for a mode of being in the world, an improvisational mode of protean, fluid, and flexible dispositions towards reality, suspicious of either-or viewpoints, dogmatic pronouncements, or supremacist ideologies. To be a jazz freedom fighter is to attempt to galvanize and energize a world-weary people into forms of organizations with accountable leadership that promote critical exchange and broad reflection. The interplay of individuality and unity is not one of uniformity and unanimity imposed from above, but rather of conflict among diverse groupings that reach a dynamic consensus subject to questioning and criticism. As with a soloist in a jazz quintet, quartet, or band, individuality is promoted in order to sustain and increase the creative tension with the group, a tension that yields higher levels of performance to achieve the aim of the collective project. That's better. The Berlin Spreebogen project, as I assume many of you in the audience know, was for the design of a new federal capital complex for Germany in Berlin along the River Spree, involving a federal parliament, chancellery, a Bundesrat, and federal press conference. The given program was something on the order of 250,000 square meters, consisting of consisting almost entirely of rooms, small rooms, something like 7,000 rooms to be spread across 62 hectares. Meeting rooms, conference rooms, rooms for secretaries, with no major spaces. In looking at this project, I realized that there were actually 3 different issues that needed to be responded to. One was the fact that this project evoked 4 separate scales of context. The second was the issues dealing with and arising from Berlin's physical history. And the third had to do with this tricky question of reflecting German national identity in a capital design. In terms of the context, there's the 4 different contexts, each operate at a different scale. The first one is the scale of the immediate neighborhood. Even though it was a national capital complex, there was much desire to integrate it somehow with the surrounding neighborhoods, residential and commercial. The second scale had to do with the larger urban picture of Berlin and its circulation systems. The third level, as a capital complex, had to do with not only, I guess would be a kind of a national scale. So if the first one was a neighborhood scale, the second was an urban scale, the third was a national scale, and the fourth, as a kind of preeminent nation, was actually the global scale. Then in terms of the Berlin as its physical history, that it is basically, to tie it into the discussion before, a city that has been very strongly defined by Cartesian parameters, by strategies of extension, delineation, superimposition, eradication, and division. Strongly defined space of objects and borders. And there's many manifestations of this. There was a kind of positivist manifestation, whether it's the Friedrich Wilhelm extension of 1734, or whether it's Albert Speer's plans for Berlin. There was also the nihilist manifestation of the strategy, such as the Allied bombing or the Berlin Wall. And there was also a self-reflective manifestation of this, such as the IBA housing projects of the 1980s or their current urbanism. I thought instead, rather than add yet another move to this kind of chess game of adding and subtracting, to actually impose a new condition rather than just a variation of the old one. And so I proposed, oh no, that's not it. Like the model? The tradition of capital design, of course, is to use unequivocal symbols and the revival of classical languages in order to establish a strong national identity. And Speer's Hall for 300,000, the termination of the north-south Nazi axis, is, I think, the extreme example of an object and a classical language used for spatial and political control. And then, of course, since reunification, the German identity, the whole question of German identity has reemerged. I didn't think it possible to project, or maybe given its history, wise to try to project a single face on such a complicated entity. Rather, I wanted to make a challenge to the representations of power by making something that was both one thing and many things. And I suppose the first thoughts about that came flying into Los Angeles at night, and the view that one gets of the city. On the right is the interchange of the Santa Monica and the San Diego freeways. Our project instead creates a viscous and differentiated plenum, making the ether void of space thematic. And I think that manifesting the ether void as an explicit theme is relevant for the nation of Germany and for the city of Berlin, in that it departs from those closed spatial systems of the past. It seeks not to add or to subtract from the urban fabric, but rather to make an opening in the city by creating a topological exception to the urban fabric. By consuming objective frames of reference, our project proposes a categorically new condition. It appears in many forms simultaneously, variously connecting to and then separating from its contexts. It is a permeable and convoluted entity, eluding clear outline. The scales that I mentioned are each dealt with separately. The first is, as I said, the neighborhood scale, and I'll try not to walk away from the microphone, which is characterized by a variety of uses around the perimeter of it. A grid is introduced onto the site, and the sort of patterning of it is taken from the existing Congress Hall by Hugh Stubbins from the 1950s over on the side, and it's repeated. And then, in fact, the grid is distorted to fit the particularities of the site, defined to the north by the raised train track and the curve of the Spree River, and of course to the south by the Unter den Linden and the Tiergarten. This Congress Hall is now used for world festivals, and so programmatically, on one hand, the morphology of the halls have adjusted themselves to the immediate site. On the other hand, the programming of the halls takes some piece of the local context, some piece of the programming of the local context, and makes a sort of national or world scale program out of it. So this is actually something that is not part of the program, but was introduced in order to be able to make a transition from the kinds of events, the sort of international events that are happening in the capital with the sort of day-to-day events that's happening around. So for instance, just to give one example, adjacent to the Tiergarten, you would have a hall of world ecology, and within where it occurs near the government buildings, you would have a hall for the United Nations, etc. At the same time, within the sort of bureaucratic functions, these were intended to give a kind of World's Fair atmosphere. The second scale had to do with the urban scale of the city. The Friedrich Wilhelm extension gave Berlin its, at the time, most distinctive urban form, which was a series of three platzes, a circle, a square, and an octagon. And the interesting feature of them is not only that it was this sort of collection of very precise geometric forms, but that it was a public space as an extrusion from plan. And as you can see from the drawing of it under construction on the right, this is very different than the Italian idea of a piazza, where it is actually excavated from an urban fabric. This is actually existing as a clear projection. I basically took the exact same strategy of projecting a public space with a distinctive geometric profile, but deployed it instead in section, as shown on the left, making a series of urban tubes. In that sense, though, unlike a piazza or a plaza, they don't make so much a place as they make a kind of trajectory. And they don't make a fixed point, but rather movement. And then, so what they do is they take on at either end the orientation and geometry of an adjacent axis or urban grid, and then shifts when it gets into the site, and then connects at its other end with another place. It's kind of like the experience of taking a subway, or what do you call it, metro, the underground, where you have an experience of one end and the other end without an intervening space. And for the same site, there's another one being proposed underground, which you see on the slide on the right, which is a kind of bundling into a giant tube of various kinds of rail and transportation networks, which then go out and connect to various parts of the city again. For the third scale, the government buildings, which is dealing to some measure with the national scale, I consider this idea that they talk about in the program, which is a dynamic flux in relationships between the various branches of government, and something which can actually change over time. So I was considering, and in fact, trying to sort of work it all out, making a bubble diagram to see how all of the various pieces have a relationship to each other. And in fact, the convention of a bubble diagram is that use is first off divided into a number of separate entities, and then each use is clearly delineated, usually by a kind of volume, and then you simply set up relationships between them, the relationship itself being a void. I actually turned that around and did what I called the spaghetti diagram rather than the bubble diagram, which is rather than building the endpoints, to actually build the relationships. So you see on the slide on the left, there is a continuous band that works its way around the entire site. And that band is given a program. So you could label it with a particular use. And it would only be, let's say, at one point in space that you would have a pure manifestation of a members of parliament office or a particular kind of meeting room or the press conference, because as I say, it is made up of this extremely small grain of offices and rooms. And instead what you would get is places in between, like a kind of dimmer switch. You could be in a place that's, say, 70% like the members of parliament office and 30% like something else. Once this band is established, you just determine the particular needs of the democracy at that time, and you build those portions of the band that are needed, and the rest of them exist as potential. See, I knew I shouldn't have put those blank slides in. We had an interesting discussion about whether modern projectors require blank slides or not. And then by extension with the other government, by how the ends of that band are treated, at least symbolically, a connection with across from Berlin to Bonn, bridging the East and West, and at the same time with the other government buildings in the former East Berlin. Then the largest scale, the sort of world scale, I proposed, which acts as the kind of large-scale binder of the project. There are two features, which are the world gardens and the festival structure, which you can see in the axonometric on the right. And the world gardens, as it interacts with the other various pieces of the program, contains examples of flora from around the world. And the festival structure actually raises to form a kind of giant shaded structure that is open under the S-Bahn track to the new train station to the north, and also for other kinds of festivals related to the government. I'll show you some of the early versions of the project, trying to work out the idea of the relationship between the various components. And then the working out of the tubes, the geometry of those tubes. More work on the tubes. And then, I guess when it comes together, you begin to see once those various components were set up, the project became much more about working out the interaction between them rather than trying to make any one particular layer. You can see the project here relative to the Reichstag. It's big. The Chancellery and the Bundesraten over on the right, the festival structure. Where the government band of government programming doesn't exist, as I said, it exists as a kind of potential and actually cuts through the intervening layers. It works sort of like the game of that paper, rock, scissors, where depending how the components come together, different things would interact. Within the buildings themselves, you can see here the kind of small scale of offices that are happening inside. That's the Parliament building itself and its relationship to the Reichstag. What you can also see is the way that the tubes work relative to it. By intermixing, there is a kind of inner and outer tube. And while the outer tube stops, the inner one provides a kind of continuous circulation through the building. So it's actually possible for the public. They asked in the program that the democratic process should be transparent. So actually here you can walk in a tube right through the government buildings. And I thought it's like they have these places in California where you can go and see sharks. And what you do is you actually walk in a tube underwater and you can sort of see them all around you. But they can't actually bite you. There you can see it weaving through the plan. And where the exhibition hall interrupted. This is a view from the Brandenburg Gate. That's the Reichstag on the right. Or the sort of exhibition hall that's directly in front of the Reichstag actually slopes to become a outdoor performance space. And that's the opening of one of the tubes. And the festival structure rising behind it. And some views of the model. You can make out here both the translucency of the structure as well as those kinds of slices that go through it. In after my first year at Cornell University, I had an opportunity to work with the Department of Mechanical Engineering as a faculty, as part of a joint appointment. But at the same time, I got involved with them because they were in the process of developing a new design studio within mechanical engineering. There's a number of people that were involved with this. The client, of course, Dean Taylor, was actually a very integral part of the project, as I'll discuss. And also I'm very glad to see Richard Scott, who functioned as project designer, who is, I haven't seen in some time, who is here this evening. The project, as it was proposed to me, I'll try to keep the sort of background sort of brief, but I mean, it was interesting because the idea of a design studio within mechanical engineering is almost unheard of. And mechanical engineering has, over the years, has become more and more of a specialized field, which on one hand it produces very sophisticated graduates, but the basic idea is that engineering is actually design. I know architects like not to think of it that way, but it's true. And what's happened is it's produced increasingly sophisticated sort of technocrats who are able to analyze, but who aren't able to design anything. At the same time, the entire discussion that I was having before about the loss of the mass production paradigm has also been revolutionary for the field of engineering. Basically, all of the kinds of traditional qualities that they used to want in students to go, and I mean, Detroit is a very clear example of where you see this, to go and live a life as an engineer, say in General Motors, has basically gone out the window. And then they're looking for very different and in a real sense very creative students because they realize that that is the only thing that's going to be competitive in today's world. So within this, there was this realization consortium which was made up of a number of schools that got together to try to do something about mechanical engineering. At the same time, Dean Taylor, the client of the project, had an additional vision. He also thought that it wasn't just a loss of the kind of manual skills of design that engineers had lost, but there was a loss of a kind of broader cultured sensibility that has characterized the great engineering projects of the past. And so part of this idea was to instill an idea of aesthetics into mechanical engineering. He was very interested in architecture, and in particular the architecture design studio as a model to introduce within mechanical engineering. So I became essentially a kind of collaborator to the project, and I had many different roles. The project, there's two aspects to it. There's the project as an entire sort of curriculum feature, and then there's the particular room in itself, the Cornell synthesis studio. My role was varied. I guess you would generally call it a kind of creative consultant. On one hand, I lectured the faculty as well as the students on the idea of a design studio and what this was. This was this very exotic creature for them to introduce in their environment, and on issues of I guess form and design as well. And then also I functioned as the architect for the project itself. And the client also had a variety of roles. Not only was he the person who originated the project, but also as an engineer, a very interesting and competent engineer, was in a very real sense a design collaborator on it. They saw the project itself as, and I grew to see it that way as well, as a kind of test or a sort of case study of the aspirations of the studio. So in order to do it, I did not do it as a contract or as a commission, but I actually joined the faculty, was given a certain amount of resources, actually a very interesting wind tunnel laboratory to use to design the project, and was sat down. It's a relatively small project, as you see. It's an interior. I was given the space just down the corridor from the actual studio and 2 doors away from the client's office. So it was this very interesting situation where the client would come by at 9 in the morning to see the project, and then would come by again at noon to see how the design had progressed. And so it was not like you would have a client meeting, but it was actually, and at first this was, to say the least, unnerving. I mean, I'm used to doing things which are difficult and then carefully chewing them and digesting them before presenting them to the client, and here there was no opportunity for that. In fact, which was an incredible experience and sort of sparked the kinds of discussions I had before. Design became a public act. I had a design there, the client was there, and everything was sort of on the table. And as long as the client recognized my expertise and I recognized his, and we all understood the aspirations of the project, it actually worked perfectly. This is it in relationship to the university. The main quadrangle is up there with the School of Architecture on the top. And this is one of Ithaca's famous gorges that run through here where students constantly commit suicide. And this is all of the engineering schools here, a kind of, that's true. I was actually in design studio and all the ambulances came and someone just kind of outside the window had taken a dive. There's another, it's sort of bracketed by gorges. There's one on this side, which is the south side of the university, and there's one the architecture school on the north side. They're quite spectacular. And this is actually a really monstrous building by Charlie Walkme, which is called the Theory Center. And to access this lab, you either can come right through the quadrangle or actually come through the main entrance of the Theory Center. And it has, even though it's tucked in there, it has quite a prominent location. On the right, I couldn't find a better slide, but the rock structure from within the gorges is really quite amazing. Most people on their first look thinks that it must have at one time been a quarry because it is so geometric. But in fact, it's the natural shape of it. A very precise geometry to the rocks. It's the most interesting, by far, the most interesting part of Ithaca. On the other hand, it is facing across this glacial rift. Down at the bottom of this is one of the Finger Lakes, Cayuga Lake. Ithaca's at the bottom of it. And so when you look out the window from the design studio, you actually see across to something like this. Also within the kind of immediate vicinity, and in a way a very important part of the project, is one of the sort of specializations of the field, which is of the department, which is fluid mechanics. And in fact, when you walk down the corridor, these are what is all over the walls. There's one faculty in particular, Professor Williamson, who's quite well known for his visualizations of fluids. And in fact, thinking about that and the kind of blurring of discipline lines and the mix of the sort of heterogeneous mix of activities that was being proposed for the studio, I thought actually the notion of fluids and of the chaotic system of fluids was quite a interesting and relevant model for this design studio. At the same time, thinking of it as something which, the architecture is something which is not static and does not just make a kind of shape to the room, but actually engages in the life of the space. I began thinking of the life and how one would represent it. On the left, of course, is a photographic study of Marais, and on the right is a study of cumulative time use, I guess. I should say the program of the studio is very interesting. We presented this at a conference in Singapore, a CAD conference, which was sort of odd because the main point of the talk was that this was not a CAD laboratory, and they thought that was very interesting because the whole topic of the symposium was on designing CAD laboratories, and of course Bill Mitchell was there with his City of Bits and his design studio of the future, and it was, the counterpoint was that this doesn't see that as a kind of isolated activity, but actually proposes a kind of vital hybrid of activities. Within the studio, I'll show you when I get to the plan, one could be doing computing, one could be doing teleconferencing, one could be actually assembling prototypes with shop tools, or having a conference there, or be doing all of those things at the same time. That was the kind of original model of trying to imagine the fluid structure mapped across the space, that you would actually model the life and the movement and the activities of the project across the space. And then some of the early studies which involved trying to, I guess, literally turn that into the form of the studio. These are quite light. For the studies for the wall surfaces, perspectives. And then on the other hand, looking at it programmatically as a thick layer or a band that would wrap its way around the entire space, and then have all of the various components. There's a very large storage component to the project, because unlike an architecture design studio, it is hot-seated. That is to say, something like 160 students use it in a given semester, and they just have a variety of studios. So instead, what you do is you have about 100 of these storage bins that have to be stored. And then the studio is also broken up as going from relatively dirty functions on the top, which is the storage cabinets, wrapping around the side to the workshop area where you have drill presses and other kinds of machines, down to what we would call the clean area, where you have the computer equipment and the teleconferencing equipment down at the bottom of the screen in either picture. And then in the middle you have these tables which do both. You have Silicon Graphics computers based at each one, and at the same time you could be sort of hammering on it. And then that same form, which was the sculpted form I showed before, rather than making it fully sculptural, was actually, I guess, a series of geometric events were determined along the length of it, and then these events were then dispersed on a regular interval. And so the basic sort of thick datum or envelope that wrapped around the entire space would have worked something like this. This is also including another wing of display out in the corridor, which ultimately we didn't have the money for, but includes a suspended piece over here. It includes the ceiling as well. Then within that, all of those various events, not really geometric, actually topological events of that model, that is to say, anywhere it bifurcated or began or ended, was placed along this thick datum at regular intervals. Then those various components were connected in a kind of irregular extrusion, such as you see on the right. And then as a kind of secondary system, that mass was, the sort of mass of smoke was shifted and recorded once again as shadow. Leaving something like that. I guess this is, you can see it fairly clearly here. That datum, this entire piece of it was eliminated, and it got quite thin along here as well. But basically you would have a display cabinet out in the corridor, and this is the corridor that would lead from the Siegel building to the main entrance of this building, so it's quite public and quite dark and unpleasant, so there's no natural light gets in there quite at all. So we have now these large glass display cabinets and some opening in the doors there. And as you go up, those are the various workstations for power tools, etc. And across the top are storage cabinets, and I'll show you in a minute how those work. And these are the locations for the 10 tables. Along here they have different kinds of these so-called computer live boards, and different counters for computers, for teleconferencing equipment, printers, plotters, etc. It's like one of these studios. I actually wish I could just spout off all of the stuff that it has, because it's wired. This is actually the flooring layout. This is that secondary projection, the sort of shadow projection as it's worked out, and then you see as it was worked out sort of directly from the computer drawings and actually constructed in that way by giving precise X and Y coordinates rather than giving measurements and angles. And then the ceiling, as you saw, becomes a rather complicated system, probably the most complicated system of the project. And that way, and that was also shown not only in terms of its x and y coordinates, but on the right, the various sculpted pieces were given their height above the finished floor. The rolling cabinets, this is not a very good picture of it here. The storage would have ended up taking a very large percentage of the studio space over. So instead, I devised a system whereby they would be double loaded onto these rolling carts, and they would simply be slid in and out, and that sort of datum envelope became the front on them. And then at the beginning of any class, one of these cabinets could hold an entire class's project in. At the beginning of a class, you would roll it out, and at the end of the class, that would close, and a different one would open for another class. But when it's closed, it makes a kind of seamless part of the interior. It's actually rolling on little tracks. This is the teleconferencing island, which is not touching the floor, as you can see. It was a teleconferencing island. Now it's a printer and plotter island. But you see here how the shadows from the original projections projected again, essentially, and then remain as basically just in the final budget cut as a two-dimensional surface. It's not quite finished. You can't tell in this picture, but you'll see it later. The entire surface is perforated steel panels, or solid and solid steel panels, where the other colors are. It's virtually the only material. It was very difficult to see the model, to see the building when working on it, because it's a very small interior. And I've actually never worked on an interior before, I don't think. It's very unpleasant. So I was constantly making models that looked like buildings. But a transparent model so you could actually see it. Even when you're inside, I found with photography, you can't, it has such a thin profile that it's very, very difficult to get a kind of comprehensive photograph. I realized I presented this project at the University of Michigan last semester, and I had just come back from a site visit. It was like half done, and I had all of these pictures I had taken, and I realized it was sort of like when my daughter was first born, and I had all these rolls of pictures, and I would make everyone sit through looking at all of them. So I tried very hard to cut down the sort of in-progress photos, but there still is a sort of set of them in here. There you see the translucency of that cabinet. And it's a flat datum, but it actually slopes up in the last sort of grid module, the last 4 feet, towards the windows. On the right, you see it more or less finished. I guess the last ones aren't in yet. You see also the way where the existing structure comes through. They're actually doing if you knew what construction was like in Ithaca, everyone marvels. They're doing quite the precise job. I think I just exude that spirit, though. Oops.
Did you draw
Where am I? Just wait a second. There we go. It was, yeah.
So you measured drawings, you did a full set of working drawings, which were measured drawings of each?
There was a, in terms of the geometry, there was a full three-dimensional computer model. And so it's just, I mean, there were, aside, the basic set was not so large, but in terms of details of components, you know, like I would produce on weekends, I would have to produce like 30 8.5 by 11s because they needed to know how a certain cabinet would go together. It worked. I mean, I should say this. This worked together with Cornell facilities, which were very, very good. Everybody actually behind the project were quite interested in the sort of spirit of it and tried to do a good job. I mean, Cornell facilities is notorious for screwing things up. There you see the rolling cabinets. I thought this looked like a 4-story building or something. These are actually, I ended up taking out almost all of mine. These are almost all the slides that my client sent me, because he's been there day by day photographing it. That's why there's a lot of different colors. It's like, this is a very odd color there. That's just the film. We see some photos of the ceiling details. And out in the corridor, the wall treatment is not there yet, but you see that's right when you walk into the entry. The glass doors are not, I think they've just gone into place. That's looking out. I don't know if you can see outside. It's a typical Ithaca day, which is 16 inches of snow. If you'll excuse me, I do have I do have another pair of trays, but there's not very much in them. It'll be fast. I hate that. There's that sort of dread when someone asks for the next set. But there's only about 15 pairs or something. Thank you. The last project I want to show is in a very, very preliminary stage, but I thought it would be interesting to share some of it with you. It is really just in the planning process. But it's a project that I'm working on together with 2 other architects in the United States, Mark Anderson and Peter Anderson of Seattle. And it is done as a kind of late entry to the Prado Museum Design Competition. The project, I think I saw, in fact, I think tomorrow we're going to see another Prado competition. The project is to take the main building, the Villanueva building, which is shown in the center of the photograph on the right, which is the historic home of the Prado, and to expand it to 2 other buildings. One which currently has their 19th century collection. They would both be just off of the top of the page there, off the top of the picture. I'll show you some other images of it. They're both sort of another couple of neoclassical buildings. One is called the Cason de Bon Retiro, and the other one is currently a military museum. And it's sort of an interesting problem, and clearly in the organizer's mind, very, very much modeled on the Louvre renovation by I.M. Pei. But basically, they looked at the situation and said that we think these old buildings are really perfect for showing art in. What we need to do is be able to get all the other stuff out of it and connect them together efficiently. And that is because when these buildings were first built, like the Villanueva building, virtually the entire thing was gallery. There was no curators, no nothing. You put all the important paintings in there. You opened the door in the morning, and those who wanted to see it saw it, and you locked it at night. Now, for reasons which still mystify me, something like 50, some people would say 75% of a museum is given over to administration, curatorial spaces, restaurants, etc. So really what they were asking for was a giant infrastructure for this complex of buildings. Of course, unlike the Louvre, which is completely self-contained, this also spreads across a good portion of a neighborhood in Madrid. It's a very interesting museum, of course, and I'm not going to, it's too late to go into a sort of history of it. But an interesting point is, of course, that it's always known as a painter's museum. It's one of the great painting collections of the world. And also more specifically, it has a very interesting curatorial history. Up until the Second World War, the curators of the Prado have always been painters themselves. In fact, this person you might recognize was the curator of the Prado from 1936 to 1939. And on the right, a statue of Velázquez. It has also a kind of interesting urban situation, just briefly. These are a couple of older, just be focused a little bit. It has a couple of older pictures here, but it shows it pretty, in a pretty clear way. You have the edge of the traditional fabric of Madrid here. You have a later expansion of it on the top, a 19th century expansion of it. And then you have that Park de Buen Retiro. And so the Prado is right there, or in this picture right there. It actually forms this entire edge of sort of monumental buildings that run across the perimeter there. And so you have a kind of dense urbanism, a kind of dotted between sort of urbanism and sort of object buildings, and then a kind of garden and field on the other side. And it still works, I think, very much like that. Here you see it here. In fact, I should have shown on the other one, the train station, which has the new complex by Rafael Moneo, is over here. And that's the beginning of the park. So you actually have a dense edge, a kind of green edge. Oh. No. Thank you. And, or it could be. And then another edge up there. They're just urban observations. Actually, I don't know if it has much to do with our project, other than this idea of something that's a transition between urban and field seemed quite interesting. Of course, the collection, Las Meninas. It is also known for its collection of the bazaar. Some people say the museum was the greatest influence in Spanish surrealism. Yeah. There's a collection of Bosch, Bruegel's, all the Goya black paintings, Saturn devouring his son, and also the kind of northern Italian. This is interesting, the northern Italian collection, things that are not the kind of rational Italian paintings, but things of, he's got one of the best collections of Titian, for instance. And something that was very important for us in this project was El Greco, in this case, the adoration of the shepherds, and the kind of space of the painting. We envision the space of the project as a continually developing event within, first, the cultural life of Spain, and second, the city of Madrid. Therefore, the Prado and its contents are constructed not as a collection of historical artifacts, but as an ever-transforming constellation of temporal events linked with material form and human experience, reflecting and generating the creation and experience of Spanish culture. It conflates form and program within a four-dimensional matrix comprising time, blending the apparently fixed and the apparently mutable. It descends from classical space by proposing a world of temporal flux within a space of roiling fullness. This full space of ambiguous material and conceptual intersubjectivity unifies the discrete object buildings of the Prado, not only materially as a physical practicality for the contemporary moment, but as an architectural manifestation in material time and event of an insight into Spanish art. Within the viscous field, particular forms and events are referenced to subjective local differentiations and relative space-times rather than to an ideal grid. And this goes back to some investigations of, first off, a kind of careful chronicling of the movement through the building in the kind of normal flux of the movement, and then an attempt to make a conflation of that movement, not only plotting, sort of typical movements of curators versus first-time visitor versus repeat visitor versus whatever, a tour guide, but also trying to give it a kind of timeline. And if you see the one on the right, there's a series of ticks that are actually indicating the relative speed of the people moving through there. And then what we actually did was to take that as a sort of movement vector and plot it against the section of space that one would be experiencing at any given point in time. This was another study of the movement on the exterior of the Prado, some of the urban movements and traffic circulations. That was one of the studies then of plotting the various sections together. This project doesn't really have a conclusion. I'm just going to keep showing you things like this, and it's going to be the end. This is actually, this is the cloud, which is a kind of site model of, I guess, everything. It's not just the buildings, but it's actually, it really is. It's like soup to nuts. But the idea was to try to make a visualization of the entire life, the sort of movement and circulation and buildings and art and experience of a proposal. Which is soft. And then an initial sort of plotting of that onto the site. A field of the relative influences of the neoclassical buildings that make up these are the other two buildings up at the top. And that Cloister sort of gets involved in it, and that's the main building there. And then the sort of, that cloud is a field, and on the right, pulling it, starting to cull out various specific elements from it. And this is just starting the mapping relative to this, not only of those programmatic areas, but actually